Hey everybody, welcome back to Race of History. We are going to get into the Sabaton history for 1648 and the 30 Years' War. I believe that Sabaton has a new song that either just came out or is about to come out, so I will probably listen to that song today. I see it all over my feed whenever they drop a new song, and I try not to listen to anything until I'm able to get on here and do the reaction for it. So, I want to go ahead and do it so I can listen to it. So I'm excited for this video, excited for that video. With all that being said, let's get into it. This was a very, very interesting song and background and history, so I'm really anxious to see what they say about it.
1648 was the end of the 30 Years' War, but it was still a year of war.
And surprise, we've written a song about it.
After nearly 30 years of constant war, of plundered cities and millions of lives lost, the warring factions were finally willing to return to the negotiation table in late 1646. No matter which side or which religion, pretty much all duchies and estates were just sick of the war by now. Not only of all the misery and the economic collapse of vast stretches of the Holy Roman Empire, but the increasing futility and absurdity of the ceaseless, endless struggle. Many felt that it was long past the time that the war had achieved any meaningful political goals, and now it was just about the interests of individuals. Even the majority of the German Protestants and those allied with Sweden and France, who admittedly wanted the grip of the Habsburg emperors loosened, even they realized there was no real alternative to Habsburg rule if they wanted to keep the empire alive in any meaningful sense. All within the empire distrusted all foreign powers by now, after the devastation that had followed their armies marching time and again through the countryside, through their homes. So, both the Catholics and the Protestants wanted to settle things. In Westphalia, in the western part of the empire, the Catholics met at Münster and the Protestants at Osnabrück to debate possibilities of a fruitful peace.
Can you imagine, I put all of this into what I know, right? Which is like more modern context. Think of the frustration and despair and fury with how stagnant World War I was, right? Like, the trenches are in the same spots, battle lines don't move, it's just, there's no end. Hundreds of thousands of people will die for, a couple hundred yards or something like that. Like, it's just, there is no end in sight. There is no light at the end of the tunnel. And that is, it gets to be very, very frustrating when that's the case, right? When there's no light at the end of the tunnel, when it just seems like people are just, like, soldiers are just dying to die. And it's causing, hunger and starvation and poverty in the domestic front, too. Because you have these countries that are spending all of their resources and manpower and everything into continuing to fight the war. So imagine a conflict that goes for 3 decades, where there's big wins and losses on each side, and wins and losses that you think, like, okay, this will be what turns the war, but it never does. There's never a win or a loss that's like so devastating that it will just immediately end it. And so how do you not become frustrated and just like, what are we doing? Like, what is the goal of this? Are we just fighting to fight? Because there's obviously not a legitimate end to this. We can fight for forever, and we'll still be in the same spot 20, 30, 40, 50 years from now, except a ton more people will be dead from the battles and disease and starvation. And it's just, like, how could you possibly rationalize that if you are one of the civilians who lives in an area that is, in the grips of this war?
They sent each other envoys and letters arguing about a common future within the empire. The Swedes were interested in northern Germany with possessions that could safeguard the Swedish realm. Most of the northern German states had little choice but to pay tribute or to ally themselves with the Swedes, since the military might of the Emperor Ferdinand III was too weak to help them. By now, the military balance had clearly swung towards his enemies. The armies of Sweden and France now outnumbered the Habsburg forces in the south, while the emperor's alliance with Maximilian of Bavaria lay in tatters. The Swedish army was still the mightiest in Germany, bolstered by many German regiments with around 63,000 men at arms. The second powerful were the French, whose interests in the empire were far more complex than simply securing their own borders. They wanted the empire to bleed, but at the same time needed to preserve the Catholic influence in Central Europe. This way, they opportunistically fought with and against the Swedes, and with or against German duchies and contingents, depending on the strategic situation. Cardinal Mazarin, who represented the French in Westphalia, wanted to expand French territory, sure, but more importantly, felt the need to cut Habsburg ties to Spain, which had just signed a truce with the Netherlands after 80 years of war.
Jesus.
The next few months were ones of constant debate. The big powers and the German cities, the estates, the dukes, the knights, they all had their demands and all wanted to have a say. They quarreled over jurisdiction rights, about compensation for war damages, about border lines on the map, who would pay for the troops to leave, who would pay for them to stay, who was rightfully owed money, which unfilled promises, threats, and boasts were still cause for concern. It was about reputation, about succession and hierarchy in the empire, about new alliances and old feuds, about persecution and amnesty.
So, okay, listening to that long list of, demands and counter demands from everybody who's negotiating, I can't help but notice that the civilians are really of no concern of anybody's anybody's jurisdiction or country or whatever. This is all pretty personal, right? Like, this is all individual influence or individual money, or like a small group of people's money or power or whatever. There really is no, even thought of the civilian populaces at all. It's just all about them, which is expected, but a little disappointing, I would say.
Radicals and moderates tried to find a solution in religious matters and the property of the church. Militarist Calvinists wanted to fight on to the end, while radical Catholics argued that a peace that enslaves souls is worse than a war that just kills the body. It was a nightmare of haggling and bickering about the future of Central Europe. And if we were to try and explain everything, we would be sitting here until the next Sabaton album comes out.
That quote that he just gave literally makes me want to gouge my eyes out. Like, God, that's just so dumb. That's so dumb. It's very easy to say. It's very easy to say whenever you're not the one, dying for the cause.
But while everyone was debating and arguing, there was one man who was not the talkative kind, and instead relied upon the ways of the warlord. Swedish Field Marshal Carl Gustav Wrangel had taken command over the Swedish forces in Germany. Not wanting to sit twiddling his thumbs while peace was on the horizon, he set out against the southern coalition into Franconia. Wrangel's tactics were by now common practices. He inflicted terror throughout the countryside by razing whole villages, shooting churches to pieces, trampling crops and fruit trees into the dirt, and of course the usual excessive amount of murdering and raping among the common folk who were unfortunate enough to stand in the way of his army.
While you don't speak of peace, all over battle seas, there's a man who aims for more than he can reach. All over, on fire, all over him, yes, it's a blaze! Stand on the road!
Wrangel raided deeper into northern Bavaria, besieging and bombarding cities as he went. He plundered those he was strong enough to take, arguing that the more he could harm the Catholics, the weaker the imperial position would be at the negotiation table. Wrangel was obsessed with the booty and the treasure of the rich aristocracy and clerics, since that was how he and his officers made their living. Maximilian and Ferdinand were well aware of that, and in turn hoped to bolster their forces enough once more to drive a wedge into the Swedish forces descending on their territory. The Battle of Zusmarshausen, though, in May 1648, ended with a Swedish victory, as the Imperials and Bavarians only escaped total destruction with maybe a few thousand men left. And with the Empire badly defeated on the battlefield, the Swedes wanted one more shining victory. Under Field Marshal von Königsmarck, they set their sights on Prague, where the whole war had started 30 years ago. A cynic would not have missed the irony in it all. As the Swedish army passed the old battlefield of the White Mountain, where the first battle of the war had been fought, the final one would be fought nearby. Bohemia had long since been drained of troops, and Prague, though still a jewel in the empire, was only held by a small garrison, now under the command of Imperial Field Marshal von Colloredo. The story goes that a disgruntled imperial lieutenant colonel, who had lost his arm in service of the empire, showed the Swedes where the city's defensive works were the weakest, and 100 Swedes overpowered the defenders on the western side of the river Moldau and gained entry into the little town of Prague. The gates were opened for the main host, and a terrible plundering began. The old fortress Hradčany was taken, and the Swedes marauded through that half of the city. But city gates across the river were barred, and citizens and students there took up arms. In defiant firefights, they stopped the Swedish troops who came charging over the Charles Bridge. Colloredo's garrison and Prague's people were determined to defend the old town. 3 times in this war, Prague had opened its gates to foreign invaders. 3 times they had suffered. Enough was enough.
The road to the city's been blocked, denied to enter the gates. Though they tried, when Prague was called to arms, they fought them on the bridge. The freedom was at stake.
Königsmarck soon realized that this was a tougher nut to crack than he had anticipated. But over the coming weeks, new Swedish contingents would arrive from Silesia and Saxony, drawn by the prospect of loot, while small imperial forces also snuck into the city to bolster the defenses. Even as 3 Swedish armies simultaneously attacked, one led by the Crown Prince Carl Gustaf himself, who had arrived to make his mark, the determined defensive line would not be broken. From July to October, the siege dragged on. The situation for the defenders looked bleaker than ever. Colloredo knew that the inhabitants of Prague would face a terrible fate if the walls were taken. So every able man was expected to stand by the barricades, while women and children helped out wherever they could, putting out fires and caring for the wounded. It was all or nothing. Rich or poor, prince or pauper, they all fought together, and they would suffer together if they failed.
Yeah, that's the whole that's the whole thing, right? Is it doesn't matter who you are, what your status is. If the city falls, you're all going to suffer the same fate. So it would behoove you to, act accordingly and defend the city with whoever you have. But it really is kind of incredible, the defense here. Like, it is, it is grossly underwhelming, but they're fighting for their lives. So I mean, they're doing everything they possibly can to hold it. And one of the things that is kind of interesting to me about history is this seems like a long time ago, right? But in the broad, stroke of history, this is relatively recent. I mean, there was field artillery on the battlefield. Like, that is pretty recent, right? I talked about this in regards to World War I Germany and kind of the rap that they get for their handling of civilians during that war. But as I've tried to point out, that was the way, this is the way warfare was done forever. Forever. This was what it was. In fact, historians still kind of look kindly, as crazy as it is to look kindly, on Genghis Khan because of his willingness to, if a city surrendered, not touch it, right? Like, he would get his tribute or set up whatever it was that he wanted to do. But if the city surrendered before they actually besieged it, it would not be plundered. It would not, they would totally leave it alone. The thing was, if they put the siege equipment together and they actually had to start a siege, there would be no mercy, right? And so that's kind of the carrot and stick that Genghis Khan worked with. That is just the way that warfare is done. Cities are taken, sacked, people are killed, horrible, horrible stuff is done. And the reason that I point out that it wasn't that long ago is because I feel like in the modern day we have this idea that humans have evolved past a point of widespread barbarity, right? I hear stuff like that all the time, that human evolution has gotten to a point, that modern society has gotten to a point where this type of widespread barbarity is just, it would never happen. And I just want to point out that was thought in World War I. In World War I, there was a thought process that humans had evolved past the point of widespread warfare, bloodshed. There's a quote in Philip Gibbs' book, Now It Can't Be Told, where he says that was kind of the cruel joke that was played on the kids, and he calls them specifically kids, referencing the soldiers of World War I, the British soldiers of World War I. He says that's the cruel joke that was played on these kids, was that they were told that humans had caged the barbarity of the past, that the whole point of life was art and love, and that once they got to the battlefield, they realized how not true that was, how quickly humans can revert back to savageness. It's a very interesting topic and discussion for me.
On October 6th, the offensive was renewed. The Swedes were now building their own bridge over the Moldau, attacking the Galgen Gate with all their might. For 2 days, they bombed it until the gaps in it were large enough for the Swedish storm attack. Taking heavy casualties, the attackers eventually forced their way into the city. Only a desperate charge of Colorado's reserve drove the Swedes out of the city once more. Then, on October 24th, 1648, the news spread like wildfire through the empire. Peace had been signed. The arguing, the debating in Westphalia had finally come to a conclusion. A 70-gun salute at Osnabrück proclaimed the end of the 30 Years' War. On the 25th, though, the Swedes attacked once more. If they ignored the peace treaty for just a few days more, they could go home as rich men. But the desperate and exhausted defenders of Prague would once again deny entry to their city. By the day's end, 800 Swedes lay dead before the breaches in walls and gates. It was not until November 5th, as a large imperial contingent appeared outside of Prague, that the frustrated Swedes began to retreat. The siege was broken. Prague had prevailed. In the peace treaties of Osnabrück and Münster that concluded the 30 Years' War, all factions had found a compromise that would guarantee a lasting peace for Central Europe. A new imperial constitution acknowledged the rights of the Protestants while keeping the Habsburg Emperor in power. Sweden and France profited as well from the weakness of the empire and extended their influence over Germany. There were smaller disagreements, of course, like who was the rightful owner of Alsace-Lorraine, and they remained unsolved. But this would surely be solved sometime soon, right? I mean, of course. It's not like it would be an issue for hundreds of years or anything. Wait, what? Yeah. Oh. Well, how about that? Okay. Well, that is all in the future. For now, all that counted was that 30 years of war, 30 of the most brutal years our world has ever seen, were over, and Central Europe was at peace. 1648, end of the 30 Years' War.
Yes.
Why did you write a song about that and not 1618, the beginning of the 30 Years' War? Oh, you wrote a lot of things about the 30 Years' War.
Oh, yes. However, that song is from the album Carolus Rex.
Yes.
And it covers basically the rise and fall of the Swedish Empire over 100 years.
Mm-hmm.
We felt the most interesting part of Sweden's involvement for, well, mostly bad, was from the end of the war.
Well, here at 16...
That's actually what was so interesting to me about them choosing to do 1648, was that it showed the other side, like it showed the other side of the coin. It wasn't a great king or a rise of an empire. It was, kind of bloodthirst and greed and devastation, and that was very, very interesting to me that they chose to go that route.
1648, Sweden is dominant in Central Europe, the most powerful army, more than the French even at this point.
Yep.
Which is interesting because then we, as we saw in Lifetime of War or Livstid Krig, that you just ran the country right into the ground with these endless wars.
Yeah, and I mean, it's we wanted to get a bit of diversity on the album as well, because for us being Swedish, singing about Swedish history, it's very easy that it becomes some sort of a glorification of the Swedish Empire. So we wanted both, well, the good and the bad, both sides of the coin at least.
Well, this is also something to do with you because you're Czech, and of course the last battle of the war, it ended where it started, back in Bohemia with the Swedes attacking Prague and taking half of the city and not taking the other half of the city.
Yep. Stopped by a Jesuit professor, if I'm not mistaken.
Jesuit professor. Yeah. Now, when I lived in Prague in the early 90s, there was the Czechs would say that the Swedes still had their crown jewels, and they really wanted the crown jewels back from Sweden. So they'd been asking crown jewels back from Sweden. And my thinking was that if, let's say, I take something from you, right? If I own it for 350 years, I think it's mine by then, Like when I left the States at the end of 1992, I left like my records with my then girlfriend, my record collection, because I didn't think I was going to be gone that long. But, I'm not going to ask for it back now. They're hers now. They are no longer my records.
Oh, you're a bigger man than me. You're a bigger man than me.
I mean, it's been nearly
no
30
woman is
years.
keeping my vinyls,
Well, but you can always get them again, and the Czechs could always get new crown jewels. Sure, you guys. In fact, I'll tell you what. You guys write in the comments. Do you think that after having the crown jewels for now it's 370 years, the Swedes should give them back to the Czechs, or do you think after owning something for 370 years, it's yours?
I mean, yeah.
Yeah, I'm curious what you guys think about this too. Y'all talked about it. There was a couple of comments in the last video talking specifically about this issue, but I'm curious what you guys think. And this is not uncommon. In fact, the uncommon part is that now global society has gotten to a point where it's actually okay to ask for stuff back. But like forever, this was just like, it's the, spoils of war. Like it is like, if you won the war, you get the spoils, and that's what it is. In fact, I'm trying to think of where archaeologists found the stele of Hammurabi. It was not where it was supposed to be. I'm trying to think of where it was. God, I can't remember. But it was found way away from where it was supposed to be, right? But the whole thing was, it was taken in warfare, and in fact, there was like some little plaque on it or next to it or whatever that was like, this is where we got it. This was, we devastated the city, took all of the stuff, salted the soil, and this was part of the loot, right? So yeah, this is just the way the world worked for forever. But going back to that idea of the evolution of humans and society, where do y'all fall on this? Do you think you give them back, or is it, like it was historically, where it is spoils of war?
Yeah. Well, I'll see what they say.
That's a good point.
So who should have them? The Swedes or the Czechs? You guys get to choose. Imagine that war. 30 years of war and coming back full circle, coming back to Prague again.
Yeah, and I mean, especially, I think by the time Charles X made his way down there, he actually sped ahead in front of the, the news.
Yeah, because they signed the peace on October 24th, and on the 25th, he was still attacking Prague. He's like, no, we got a few more days before we can still pretend that the peace isn't signed, and we can make a lot of money if we break through. Yep. He had 3 armies by then he had. So then he was just still Prince Carl Gustaf. He hadn't become kungen.
Yeah, because his cousin hadn't,
died? Oh, abdicated.
Abdicated,
Yeah,
yes, that's true.
See, you know more Swedish history than I do.
Well, you know more American history than I do.
I'm pretty certain I do.
You know more history, period.
And I know more British colonial history than you do, as we discovered in Rock's Drift.
Yes.
Well, whoever you are, that's it for today for Sabaton History.
So if you subscribe and if you become a patron, you have the chance to get our old Sabaton albums with in-this comments talking about the historical background of each song, similar to this video, but in an audio format. Really beautiful, really nicely done.
And that's all for today. Thank you very much, and see you soon.
Okay, so that was Sabaton History for 1648. Really interesting history discussion and background. I'm curious what you guys think about it, about, some of the things that were talked about, or that I referenced, or even some of the things that I asked specifically about. You guys let me know in the comments. I am going to get that other Sabaton song out. Unkillable Soldier, I think is what it is. I just saw it a couple of times scrolling through my feed, but I think that's what it's called. That one should be out later today, literally as soon as I can get it out. But as always, like, comment, subscribe, help me keep building the channel over here, and I will see you all next time.